I believe in Roger Goodell's office, there's a desk with a big red button on it, and by pressing that button, he can cause the NFL to play more games and, in return, make more money. Recently, it seemed like he can't stop pressing it. We've seen the NFL go from 16 regular season games to 17. We've seen them add playoff spots, which has resulted in more games. And maybe most importantly, recently he said that the next logical step for the NFL is to move to an 18th regular season game. And I think there's some truth to that. Numbers do go 16, 17, 18, so 18 is up next. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, would that 18th regular season game be a good thing, or is the league overexpanding and bloating itself? Today I want to talk a little bit about that, and I think mostly what it comes down to, I think we could all agree, is whether or not adding an 18th game would affect player health negatively. Now, I think we can all agree that more football is good. And if there's an opportunity for more football to be played, then the NFL should seriously explore that. However, if that more football comes with the negative side effect of more injuries, specifically teams being more injured when the playoffs roll around, I think most fans would agree that it's not worth it. By expanding 1 week, the NFL would move from 272 regular season games to 288, a pretty minimal increase. And I think a lot of fans would look at that and off-rip say, it's probably not worth it. I'd rather just see guys healthier. I mean, even as it stands right now, we see a lot of teams get so injured come playoff time that they can't really compete like they should be able to. The Lions are a great example of this. They went 15-2. We were excited about them all year, but their defense got so banged up by the end of it, they really didn't have a chance to contend. Now, obviously, that's partially the nature of football, and you're never going to be able to completely avoid it, but by playing more games, you're probably making it more likely that that happens, and we want to avoid it as much as we possibly can. This is the battle that the NFL faces. They want to play as many games as possible, but the more games they play, the more injured people are going to be. If injuries didn't exist, they would probably have an 82-game season like the NHL and the NBA does. Honestly, they might be playing 2 games a day for the entire season, if they could. This is to say that if they're going to expand, they're going to have to mitigate injury risk in some way. And I believe they've got a couple of really good options to do this. The one that they seem to be pointing to immediately is taking away a preseason game. Right now they play 17 regular season games and 3 preseason games. If they move to 18 regular season and 2 preseason, they could argue they're not actually adding any football to be played. They're not actually adding any extra games. They're just taking one game that doesn't really have any impact on the season and making it a game that does impact the season. But the clear issue with this is that the guys who are getting the most wear and tear during the season, the starters, already aren't really playing that much in the preseason games. They might get in for a drive or two, especially in the last game, because you want to keep guys warmed up. But it seems like now more than ever, starters are playing less and less and less. They might get 10 snaps, 15 snaps. In a regular season game, that won't be the case. So for the guys who are going to get the most strain during the year, they're still going to see more play time. They're still going to have more on their plate, regardless of what you do with the preseason. But there's other options that have been discussed, namely adding a second bye. We already see teams get 1 bye during the year, but if you added a game and then gave them an extra week of rest to maybe allow them to more fully heal during the middle of the season, then it's possible that you could play more football and not only mitigate the injury risk, but actually have less injuries overall. Now, whether or not the extra week of rest outweighs the extra game played is tough to know without actually seeing it in action. It could be that an extra game is an extra game and it leads to more injuries anyway, but we've seen guys like Joe Burrow come out and say, if we're going to go to an 18th game, I think it could work, but we need to see that extra bye, and I think that would be successful. Ultimately, though, someone's going to have to make the call on whether or not that trade-off is worth it and keeps players healthy. But luckily, that somebody is likely going to be the NFL Players Association. The current collective bargaining agreement locks in a 17-game season up until 2030, meaning that the NFL can't just decide to expand to 18 games. They need the approval of the Players Association to any regular season change for at least the next 5 years. Players Association obviously has the interest of the players in mind, so if they come together and decide an 18th game wouldn't be a bad thing if we can get certain concessions like maybe 1 fewer preseason game, maybe an extra bye, or possibly some changes in the type of turf that they use, then great. It's not necessarily a guarantee that they make the right call, but at least the people who are making the call will really be attempting to do what's best for the players. So when I look at the biggest issue that you'd expect to see with an expanded regular season, I actually think there's enough tools at the NFL and the NFLPA's disposal to make it work without significantly increasing the number of injuries that we see in a year. But there's other concerns that you could have with an expanded regular season. One of them would be maybe that you feel like the NFL is watering down its product by continuing to expand and expand and expand the season. As much as we all want more football, I think part of what makes the NFL so special is that it doesn't play a million regular season games and let every team into the playoffs. It's a more limited format where each individual game matters, and every time you add an extra game, it makes every other game slightly less important, slightly less valuable. But I'll be honest, I think that the NFL would have to expand to a pretty gaudy number of games before you really started to feel like a regular season matchup didn't matter as much as it used to. The gap between, 14 games like they used to play and even up to 20 games really is not that big. If you went from 14 games to 100 games, then yeah, each individual one would start to feel pretty pointless, and by week 40 it'd probably be you and me starting at quarterback. But because of the nature of football, I just can't imagine the NFL ever gets to that point, so it's really not too big of a concern for me. The other issue is the record books. As you expand the number of games in a season, old records when the NFL played fewer games become easier and easier to break. And it becomes tougher and tougher to compare old records where maybe they only played 14 games or 16 games to new records where they got 2 extra games. We can see situations like we almost did this year if Saquon Barkley had played a 17th regular season game where, yeah, someone might have more yards in a single season, but how long a single season is has changed. And it's actually more impressive to have maybe 2,104 yards in 16 games than it would be to have 2,107 yards in 17 games. However, I have 2 reasons why I'm not that concerned with this. Number one is that I kind of think we've already jumped the shark. We've already added more games. I mean, it used to be 12, then it used to be 14, then it used to be 16. Now it's 17. It's never consistently stayed the same number. Going to an 18th game does mean it's even easier to break some of those all-time records, and they stuck at 16 for a while, so it almost feels like you're leaving behind a large portion of like the modern era of football when you go to 18. But as annoying as that is, it does feel like a bridge crossed. The other thing that I would say is that you can't really compare old records to modern day records regardless of the number of games that we've played, because the game is going to change and evolve in ways outside of just the number of games that we play. Like, you already can't look back and say, oh, well, this guy had this many yards, and today this guy has this many yards, and that's a fair, equal way to compare them. I mean, Andy Dalton is probably going to finish with more passing yards all time than Joe Montana. I could say the same thing with like running backs. Back in the day, it used to be more popular to give one guy a ton of carries. Like, you'd see dudes break 400 carries or get 350 carries all the time. It was more common. Now there's more split backfields, and because of that, individual statistics like all-time rushing yards or even single-season rushing yards are a little bit harder to hit, depending. I'm not saying this to come across like I don't care about the record books. I do. But at the same time, I mean, you could shoot down almost any rule change by arguing that it makes past records a little bit different and not able to quite one-to-one match up to modern day numbers. And if that's the case, you can't continue to adapt and evolve with the game as it changes. Now, I don't think that going to 18 games is something that the NFL is doing because the game has adapted and evolved. I think it's something that they're doing because it makes them more money and they want to make more money. But in general, I do think that at some point we got to let the records go. All this being said, should you be excited about the NFL potentially expanding the regular season? I'm going to be real with you. It's really not that big of a deal. At all. It's like a 5% increase in this season. It's not going to feel that different. And I'm not going to tell you to get excited about the NFL like making more money. That doesn't really get me pumped up. But at the same time, I feel decently confident it's not going to be some huge negative. So it's cool. We're fine. If you stuck all the way through the video, thank you for watching. I've got some bigger videos coming in the future. I know I said that last time, but this time I really mean it. And you gotta believe me. If you liked it, make sure to like. If you commented it, make sure to comment it. If you subscribed it, make sure to subscribe. Please hit the bell. I'll drop my other links down below, and I'll catch y'all next time. Actually, I'm going to give you guys a better call to action. I've been looking at my demographics, and I've noticed it's a lot of young men, ages like 13 to 17. So I want you to imagine that hitting the bell is like Fortnite, maybe. It's like a Fortnite victory. For my Gen Alpha listeners, I want you to imagine that the bell is Skibbity Toilet. And by hitting it, you either defeat him or help him, depending on where you stand.